Maria Santos never imagined that her hands, calloused from gripping steering wheels for 12-hour shifts, would one day save hundreds of lives in the most dangerous war zone on Earth. Growing up in a small village outside Manila, she learned to drive her father's old jeepney when she was barely 14, weaving through crowded streets to help support her family of 8 children. The year was 2019, and Maria had been working as a transport driver for various companies across the Philippines for over 15 years. Her reputation was solid. She was punctual, careful, and never complained about long routes or difficult passengers. At 34, she had managed to save enough money to send 3 of her younger siblings to college, something that filled her with quiet pride. When the opportunity came to work as a driver for an international humanitarian organization, Maria jumped at the chance. The pay was better than anything she had ever earned, and the job would take her to different countries where she could help people in need. She had always felt a calling to serve others, inherited from her mother who had worked as a nurse in their local clinic for decades. The training was intense. Maria learned about international protocols, emergency procedures, and how to operate in conflict zones. She studied maps of countries she had never heard of, memorized radio codes, and practiced defensive driving techniques that seemed more like something from an action movie than real life. Her instructors were impressed by her natural ability to stay calm under pressure and her remarkable spatial awareness on the road. Her first assignment was in South Sudan, a country torn apart by civil war since 2013. The humanitarian organization needed experienced drivers who could transport medical supplies, food, and personnel safely through areas where violence could erupt at any moment. Maria packed her few belongings, said goodbye to her family, and boarded a plane for what she thought would be a straightforward driving job. The reality of South Sudan hit her like a physical blow. The heat was crushing. The roads were mostly dirt tracks filled with potholes that could swallow a small car, and the constant sound of distant gunfire created a soundtrack of tension that never stopped. Her base was a compound surrounded by high walls topped with razor wire, where aid workers from dozens of countries worked around the clock to provide relief to displaced populations. Maria quickly established herself as one of the most reliable drivers in the fleet. While other drivers complained about the conditions or refused certain routes, she accepted every assignment with the same steady determination that had carried her through years of Manila traffic. She developed an almost supernatural ability to read the road ahead, sensing danger before it became visible and finding alternate routes when the main roads became impassable. Her supervisor, James Patterson, a veteran aid worker from Scotland, began assigning her the most critical missions. When medical supplies needed to reach a remote clinic before vaccines spoiled in the heat, Maria got the call. When a team of doctors needed transport to a village where fighting had recently stopped, Maria was behind the wheel. She never asked for hazard pay or special recognition. She simply did her job with a professionalism that earned respect from everyone in the compound. The turning point came on a humid Tuesday morning in March 2020. Maria was assigned to drive a convoy of 3 vehicles carrying emergency medical supplies to a displaced persons camp about 60 miles northeast of their base. The camp housed over 15,000 people who had fled fighting in the Jonglei region, and they were running critically low on antibiotics and surgical supplies. The convoy consisted of Maria's lead vehicle, followed by 2 supply trucks driven by local contractors. In her passenger seat sat Dr. Elena Vasquez, a Spanish surgeon who had volunteered to accompany the mission to assess medical needs at the camp. The drive should have taken about 3 hours each way, allowing them to return before the afternoon heat became unbearable. Everything went according to plan for the first 90 minutes. Maria navigated the rough roads with practiced ease, maintaining radio contact with the supply trucks and checking in regularly with their base. Dr. Vasquez was impressed by Maria's knowledge of the terrain and her ability to spot potential hazards long before they became problems. They talked about their families, their motivations for working in such a dangerous place, and their hopes for the people they were trying to help. The first sign of trouble came when Maria noticed that the usual checkpoints along their route were abandoned. Military positions that should have been manned by government forces stood empty, with fresh tire tracks leading away from the road. Maria immediately radioed their base and requested an update on security conditions, but Static was the only response. The radio jamming meant they were entering an area where communication was being deliberately blocked. Dr. Vasquez noticed the tension in Maria's shoulders as she gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Should we turn back?" the doctor asked, noting the abandoned checkpoints and the eerie silence along what should have been a busy road. Maria shook her head, explaining that they were already more than halfway to their destination, and the medical supplies they carried could mean the difference between life and death for people in the camp. As they crested a small hill, Maria saw something that made her blood run cold. About a mile ahead, black smoke was rising from what looked like vehicles on the road. Through her binoculars, she could see that their route was blocked by a burning truck, and armed figures were moving around the area. She immediately stopped the convoy and tried to raise their base on the radio, but the jamming was still in effect. The supply truck drivers were getting nervous, and one of them suggested they should abandon the mission and return to base immediately. But Maria knew that turning around on the narrow road would take precious time, and their heavily loaded vehicles would be sitting ducks if hostile forces were in the area. She made a decision that would change everything. Instead of retreating, she would find an alternate route to complete their mission. Using her detailed knowledge of the local terrain, Maria guided the convoy off the main road onto a barely visible track that wound through scattered acacia trees and rocky outcroppings. The route was treacherous, with steep descents and narrow passages that tested every ounce of her driving skill, but it would allow them to bypass the blocked road and approach the displaced person's camp from an unexpected direction. For 2 hours, Maria navigated terrain that most drivers would have considered impassable. Dr. Vasquez held on tightly as their vehicle lurched and bounced over rocks and through dried creek beds. The supply trucks struggled to keep up, their heavy loads making them unstable on the uneven ground. But Maria maintained radio contact with their drivers, guiding them through the most difficult sections with calm, clear instructions. When they finally reached the displaced person's camp, Maria was shocked by what she saw. The camp was under attack by an armed group that had surrounded the perimeter and was systematically destroying shelters and medical facilities. Thousands of civilians, mostly women and children, were trapped inside the camp with nowhere to run. The few security guards who were supposed to protect the camp had either fled or been overwhelmed by the attackers. Dr. Vasquez immediately began treating wounded civilians who were streaming toward their vehicles, using the medical supplies they had brought as makeshift treatment stations. But Maria realized that simply delivering supplies was no longer enough. The situation had become a rescue mission, and she was the only person with the skills and equipment to get people to safety. Without waiting for orders or permission, Maria began organizing an evacuation. She used her radio to contact other aid organizations in the area, providing them with coordinates and requesting immediate assistance. She directed the supply truck drivers to begin loading the most severely wounded civilians for transport to the nearest medical facility, while she scouted possible escape routes from the camp. The attackers hadn't noticed their arrival yet, focused as they were on looting and destroying the camp's infrastructure. But Maria knew it was only a matter of time before they were discovered, and then their small convoy would be hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. She had to act fast, and she had to act smart. Drawing on years of experience navigating dangerous situations, Maria developed a plan that was both audacious and practical. She would use her intimate knowledge of the local terrain to guide groups of civilians to safety along routes that the attackers couldn't follow with their heavy vehicles. It would mean making multiple trips into increasingly dangerous territory, but she couldn't abandon the thousands of people who were counting on them for survival. Maria's first evacuation run began at dawn the next morning. She had spent the night hidden in a grove of trees about a mile from the camp, watching the attackers' patterns and planning her approach. The armed group had set up positions around the main entrances to the camp, but they seemed unaware of the smaller paths that Maria had discovered during her reconnaissance. Working with Dr. Vasquez and 2 local camp leaders, Maria organized the civilians into small groups of 20 to 30 people each. Priority was given to families with young children, elderly people who couldn't walk long distances, and anyone who was wounded or sick. Each group would be led along different routes to avoid detection, with Maria driving ahead to scout for dangers and establish safe rally points. The first group consisted of 27 people, including 8 children under the age of 5. Maria loaded them into her vehicle and the back of one supply truck, then began navigating a route that would take them through terrain so rough that most people wouldn't even consider it passable on foot. For 3 hours, she guided them through dried riverbeds, around rocky outcroppings, and across areas where the vegetation was thick enough to provide cover from observation. The children were terrified and crying, while their mothers tried desperately to keep them quiet. Maria found herself talking softly in her limited English mixed with gestures and smiles, trying to reassure people who had already lost everything except their lives. She shared her own water and the small amount of food she carried, even though she knew she would need her strength for what lay ahead. When they reached the designated safe zone, a temporary camp run by another humanitarian organization 15 miles away, Maria didn't pause to rest. She immediately began planning her return trip to collect the next group of evacuees. The radio was still jammed in the combat area, so she couldn't get updates on the situation at the original camp, but smoke continuing to rise from that direction told her that the attack was ongoing. Her second trip was more dangerous. The attackers had become more organized and were now patrolling the area around the camp in pickup trucks mounted with heavy weapons. Maria had to take an even longer route, adding 2 hours to what was already an exhausting journey. This time, she was evacuating 31 people, including several who were wounded and needed to be carried on improvised stretchers. Dr. Vasquez had decided to stay at the safe zone to treat the wounded who were arriving, but she had given Maria a crash course in basic medical care. As they moved through the wilderness, Maria found herself stopping frequently to check on people who were struggling, helping to bandage wounds that had reopened during the difficult journey, and making life-or-death decisions about who could continue and who needed to be left behind. One of the wounded was a young mother named Grace who had been shot in the leg while trying to protect her 2-year-old daughter. The wound was infected and she was running a high fever, but she refused to slow down the group. Maria made the difficult decision to carry both Grace and her daughter in her vehicle, even though it meant leaving behind supplies that might be needed later. The journey became a nightmare of endurance and determination. Maria's hands were bleeding from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and her back ached from hours of driving over terrain that felt more like a demolition course than a road. But every time she felt like she couldn't continue, she looked at the faces of the people counting on her and found new reserves of strength. On her third evacuation run, Maria encountered her first direct contact with the attacking forces. She was leading a group of 42 people through a valley when she spotted 3 pickup trucks approaching from the north. There was no cover nearby, and the civilians she was guiding included elderly people who couldn't move quickly. Maria made a split-second decision that saved all their lives. Instead of trying to hide or run, Maria drove directly toward the approaching vehicles, flashing her headlights in the international signal for medical emergency. She had calculated that the attackers would assume she was one of their own vehicles responding to some crisis, and her gamble paid off. The pickup trucks slowed down but didn't stop, and Maria was able to guide her group into a depression in the landscape where they remained hidden until the patrol passed. The incident taught Maria that audacity could sometimes be more effective than caution. She began using tactics that seemed almost reckless but were actually carefully calculated risks based on her growing understanding of how the attackers operated. She learned their patrol schedules, their preferred routes, and, most importantly, their blind spots. By her 5th evacuation run, word had spread among other humanitarian organizations about the extraordinary rescue operation being conducted by a Filipino driver. International news crews were arriving at the safe zone to document the story of thousands of civilians being saved by someone who wasn't a soldier, diplomat, or professional rescue worker. But Maria avoided the reporters, focused entirely on the job at hand. The most challenging evacuation came on her 7th trip. Maria was attempting to rescue a group of 68 people, including 15 children who had been separated from their families during the initial attack. The children were traumatized and couldn't understand why they had to leave the only home they remembered. Some of them kept trying to run back toward the camp, not understanding that it was no longer safe. Maria realized that she needed help managing such a large group, so she recruited 2 young men from among the evacuees who had military training. Together, they developed a system of hand signals and quiet communication that allowed them to move the large group without alerting hostile patrols. The journey took 18 hours, including a 12-hour wait in a hidden location while a major battle raged just 3 miles away. During that long wait, Maria shared her life story with the people she was protecting. She told them about growing up poor in the Philippines, about working multiple jobs to support her family, and about her decision to leave everything behind to help strangers in a foreign country. In return, they shared their own stories of loss, hope, and determination to survive. One of the children, a 7-year-old boy named Samuel who had watched his father killed during the attack, attached himself to Maria like a shadow. He couldn't speak English, and she couldn't speak his language, but they communicated through smiles, gestures, and small acts of kindness. Samuel began helping Maria with small tasks like carrying water bottles and watching for danger signals, becoming her unofficial assistant. As the weeks passed, Maria's evacuation operation grew more sophisticated. She had established a network of safe houses and supply caches along multiple routes, allowing her to support longer journeys and larger groups. Other drivers and aid workers had joined her efforts, creating a coordinated rescue network that was operating entirely outside official channels. The attacking forces had become aware that people were escaping from the camp, but they couldn't figure out how it was happening. Maria's routes were so unconventional and her timing so unpredictable that she stayed one step ahead of their patrols. She had become a ghost in the landscape, appearing when people needed her most and vanishing before she could be caught. Her reputation began spreading beyond the immediate area. Radio messages picked up by government forces mentioned a mysterious driver who was making the attackers look foolish. Other humanitarian organizations began requesting her assistance with their own evacuation operations. Military commanders started asking their intelligence officers for information about the person who was conducting such effective rescue missions without any official support. But Maria remained focused on the immediate task. Every day that passed meant more lives saved, but it also meant increasing danger as the attackers adapted their tactics and began actively hunting for the evacuation routes. She knew that her luck couldn't last forever, and she began planning for what she would do when the situation finally became too dangerous to continue. The breakthrough came during her 15th major evacuation mission. Maria was leading a group of 53 people through a particularly difficult section of terrain when she encountered a government patrol that had been searching for her. Instead of the confrontation she expected, the patrol leader, a captain named David Mawat, asked for her help in planning a major rescue operation. Captain Mawat explained that government forces had finally received reinforcements and were preparing to retake the displaced persons camp, but they needed someone with intimate knowledge of the terrain and the attackers' positions. Maria's weeks of observations and her detailed mental maps of the area made her the most valuable intelligence asset available to the rescue force. The government operation to retake the displaced persons camp was scheduled for 3 days later, and Maria found herself in the unusual position of being a key strategic advisor to military officers with decades of combat experience. Captain Mawat and his staff were amazed by the detailed knowledge she had accumulated about enemy positions, patrol patterns, and the terrain surrounding the camp. Maria had mapped out 17 different approach routes, identified 12 key observation points, and documented the daily schedules of hostile patrols with the precision of a professional intelligence analyst. Her weeks of conducting evacuation missions had given her a better understanding of the tactical situation than any satellite imagery or reconnaissance report could provide. The plan that emerged from their planning sessions was unlike anything the government forces had attempted before. Instead of a conventional assault that would likely result in heavy casualties among the remaining civilians in the camp, they would use Maria's evacuation routes to insert small teams of soldiers who could neutralize key enemy positions from within. Maria would guide these teams personally, using her knowledge of hidden paths and safe positions to get them into place undetected. On the night before the operation, Maria couldn't sleep. She had gone from being a simple driver to being responsible for a military mission that could save thousands of lives or result in a devastating failure. The weight of that responsibility was unlike anything she had ever experienced, but she drew strength from thinking about all the people she had already helped escape and those who were still trapped in the camp. The operation began at 4 in the morning with Maria leading the first team of 12 soldiers along a route she had used multiple times for evacuations. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were special forces troops trained for precisely this kind of mission. But even with all their training and equipment, they were amazed by Maria's ability to move silently through terrain that seemed impassable in the darkness. For 2 hours, Maria guided them through dried creek beds, around rocky outcroppings, and through patches of thick vegetation that provided cover from enemy observation posts. The soldiers carried specialized equipment for their assault, but Maria traveled with only a radio, a water bottle, and her determination to complete the mission successfully. The first enemy position was a checkpoint that controlled access to the main road leading to the camp. Maria had observed this position for weeks and knew that it was typically manned by 4 guards who rotated shifts every 6 hours. She guided the assault team to a position just 50 meters from the checkpoint, close enough for them to neutralize the guards without alerting other enemy forces. The soldiers moved with professional efficiency, securing the position in less than 3 minutes without firing a shot. But Maria's job was far from over. She had to guide 2 more teams to their assigned positions before the main assault could begin, and each route presented its own unique challenges and dangers. The second team was tasked with securing the high ground overlooking the camp's main entrance. This required a much longer and more difficult approach, including a climb up a steep rocky slope that most people would consider impossible in daylight, let alone in the darkness before dawn. Maria had discovered this route during one of her early reconnaissance missions, but she had never attempted it while guiding others. The climb took nearly 3 hours and tested the physical limits of even the well-trained soldiers. Maria's experience navigating difficult terrain served her well as she found handholds and footholds that weren't visible to others, guiding the team up sections of the slope that seemed nearly vertical. When they finally reached the summit, they had a commanding view of the entire camp and could provide crucial support for the main assault. The third and most dangerous insertion was into the camp itself. Maria would guide a team of medics and engineers to a position where they could begin treating wounded civilians and preparing safe evacuation routes as soon as the main assault began. This meant penetrating the enemy's perimeter and moving through areas where hostile forces were concentrated. Maria had identified a drainage ditch that ran along the eastern edge of the camp, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation and abandoned equipment. The ditch was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and it was filled with stagnant water and debris that made movement slow and difficult. But it provided a way to reach the camp's interior without being detected by sentries watching the obvious approaches. The journey through the drainage ditch was a nightmare of physical discomfort and psychological tension. Maria led 6 people through nearly 2 miles of cramped, flooded passages, stopping frequently to check for obstacles and listen for signs of enemy activity above them. The team included Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had volunteered to return to the dangerous area where their mission had begun weeks earlier. When they finally emerged from the drainage ditch, they were inside the camp's perimeter but still had to reach a position where they could establish a treatment station. Maria guided them through the ruins of destroyed shelters, past areas where hostile forces had set up defensive positions, and around obstacles that could reveal their presence to enemy patrols. The main assault began just as the sun was rising, with government forces attacking from 3 directions simultaneously. The teams that Maria had guided into position played crucial roles in the operation's success. The checkpoint team secured the main road, preventing enemy reinforcements from reaching the camp. The high ground team provided sniper support that neutralized key enemy leaders. And the medical team began treating wounded civilians even as the battle continued around them. But Maria's most important contribution came when the assault encountered unexpected resistance. The attacking forces had prepared defensive positions that weren't visible from a distance, and The main government advance was stopped by heavy weapons fire from concealed bunkers. The assault commander radioed for Maria's assistance in finding an alternate approach that could outflank these positions. Without hesitation, Maria left the relative safety of the medical station and began reconnoitering the enemy positions under fire. Using techniques she had learned during weeks of avoiding hostile patrols, she moved through areas where soldiers were reluctant to go, mapping out enemy strongpoints and identifying their weaknesses. She discovered that the main enemy defensive line had a critical vulnerability, a gap between two bunkers that was covered only by a single machine gun position. The gap was hidden from most angles, but Maria had found a route that would allow assault troops to approach it without being detected. More importantly, she could guide them there personally. The flanking maneuver that followed became a textbook example of how local knowledge could overcome superior firepower. Maria led a company of government soldiers through terrain that the enemy had considered impassable, bringing them to a position where they could attack the defensive line from behind. The assault was swift and decisive, breaking the enemy's resistance and allowing the main force to advance into the camp. As government forces secured the camp, Maria found herself in the strange position of being simultaneously a civilian aid worker and a key military advisor. She helped coordinate the evacuation of wounded civilians while also briefing commanders on enemy escape routes and hidden weapon caches that she had observed during her reconnaissance missions. The final phase of the operation was a massive humanitarian effort to care for the thousands of civilians who had survived the attack and the subsequent battle. Many of them were people that Maria had helped evacuate in previous weeks, and they greeted her return with emotions that ranged from relief to joy to amazement that she had come back for those who couldn't escape on their own. Dr. Vasquez established a field hospital that treated more than 300 wounded people in the first 24 hours after the camp was secured. Maria found herself working as everything from a medical assistant to a translator to a logistics coordinator, using skills that she had developed during her weeks of conducting independent rescue operations. The young boy Samuel, who had become Maria's unofficial assistant during their earlier escape, had been hiding in the camp throughout the battle. When he saw Maria again, he ran to her with tears streaming down his face, and, for the first time in weeks, Maria allowed herself to show the emotion she had been suppressing. The reunion reminded everyone present that behind the tactical success of the operation were human relationships that had been forged in the crucible of shared danger. News of Maria's role in the rescue operation spread quickly through international media. Reporters who had been covering the humanitarian crisis were amazed by the story of a driver who had single-handedly evacuated thousands of people and then played a crucial role in a successful military operation. But when they tried to interview her, Maria deflected attention away from herself and toward the needs of the people who were still recovering from their ordeal. The Philippine government announced that Maria would receive their highest civilian honor for bravery, and the United Nations nominated her for a prestigious humanitarian award. Multiple countries offered her citizenship, and several universities wanted to give her honorary degrees. But Maria's response to all this attention was characteristically practical. She wanted to continue working as a driver for humanitarian organizations in places where people needed help. 6 months later, Maria was working in another conflict zone, this time in Syria, where her reputation had preceded her. Local commanders and aid organizations specifically requested her assistance with operations in dangerous areas, knowing that her unique combination of driving skills, tactical knowledge, and unshakable courage could make the difference between success and failure. The camp in South Sudan was rebuilt and reopened as a model facility for displaced persons, with improved security and better infrastructure. A small monument was erected there honoring all the aid workers who had risked their lives to help others. But those who knew the full story understood that it primarily commemorated the extraordinary heroism of a woman who had started as just a driver and became something far greater. Maria never considered herself a hero. When asked about her motivations, she always gave the same simple answer. She had seen people who needed help, and she had the skills to provide that help, so she did what any decent person would do in the same situation. But those who worked with her knew that what she had accomplished required not just basic decency, but extraordinary courage, intelligence, and determination. Today, Maria continues to work in conflict zones around the world, training other drivers in advanced techniques for operating in dangerous environments and serving as an advisor to humanitarian organizations planning operations in hostile territories. Her story has become legendary among aid workers, proof that heroism can emerge from the most unexpected places and that sometimes the most important battles are won not by soldiers or politicians, but by ordinary people who refuse to accept that suffering is inevitable. The thousands of people whose lives Maria saved have scattered across the world, many of them rebuilding their lives in new countries and communities. But they carry with them the memory of a woman who risked everything to give them a chance at survival, and many of them have dedicated their own lives to helping others in honor of the example she set. Maria's transformation from driver to battlefield hero demonstrates that true heroism isn't about having special training or equipment. It's about recognizing when action is needed and having the courage to act, regardless of personal risk. Her story continues to inspire people around the world who face their own challenges and wonder whether one person can really make a difference in the face of overwhelming odds.